What if the reason so many people stay broke is because they're chasing the wrong kind of rich, and that mistake feels amazing right up until it traps you? Because there's a brutal difference between looking successful and actually owning your life, and once you see it, money stops being a flex and starts being a weapon. And the conversation that follows might completely change how you think about wealth, freedom, and what you're really buying every time you spend. He basically says he writes for one person, and that person is him. That is such a dangerous level of honesty. But also, weirdly, that is why it works. He is not chasing applause, he is chasing clarity. Which is rare, because most people are basically writing customer service emails. Very polite pandering with a hardcover. And his whole thing is that money is really about independence. Not status, not the car, not the dinner reservation flex. Just the ability to wake up and not be owned by your calendar. That line hurts because it's true. He splits rich and wealthy, and that split is vicious. Rich is spending, wealthy is unspent money sitting there like a quiet bodyguard. Which is less sexy than a Lamborghini, obviously, but also more useful than a Lamborghini by a mile. Because the real thing you are buying is future choices. That is such a clean way to think about it. Like every dollar saved is a little piece of your future that you own. That is a way better pitch than buy this thing and feel important for 6 minutes. Although people absolutely do prefer the 6-minute importance hit. Oh, completely, because the car photo gets likes today. And the saved money gets you freedom in 5 years. That is the whole fight, right? Instant social approval versus delayed self-respect. He would hate how good that sounded just now. Too neat, too Instagram caption. But it is basically the argument. What got me was his dad's story. An ER doctor for 20 years, night shifts, people dying in your arms. That is not a life where you should be forced to pretend you love your schedule. And because the family lived below their means, he could just stop. That is the whole point. Money bought him an exit. Not a yacht, not a bigger kitchen, an exit. Honestly, the best luxury item is being able to say no. And his point about burnout hits harder because so many people cannot quit. They have the car, the house, the image, and zero control. Congratulations, you bought yourself a hostage situation. Harsh, but not wrong. He keeps coming back to autonomy as a health issue. Which sounds dramatic until you realize stress is literally wrecking people. Heart disease, anxiety, sleep, all of it. Your body does not care that your job title looks impressive. Your arteries are not impressed by LinkedIn. That should be on a t-shirt. But the wildest part is that even rich people can be trapped. Like he talks about CEOs making insane money and still being time poor. If your day is owned by other people, you are not rich in the way that matters. You are just an expensive employee with better shoes. Brutal, but yes. And then Warren Buffett becomes the counterexample. He is absurdly wealthy, but his day is still his. That is the trick. Delegation bought him time, not just money. Most people think success means more meetings, which is hilarious. Because more money often just means more obligations. And Housel's point is that the goalpost keeps moving. That is the sneaky trap. You think the target is $1 million, then it becomes 5, then 10. The brain is basically a greedy little hedge fund. Yeah, it never says thank you, it just asks for more. And then he flips it with expectations. Low expectations plus decent progress equals happiness. Which people hate hearing because it sounds unambitious. But he is not saying be lazy, he is saying stop letting your wants outrun your reality. That Stephen Hawking story is insane for that exact reason. Reduced to 0 expectations, then every day becomes bonus time. Imagine waking up and just being grateful for light through the window. That sounds extreme, but maybe that is the cleanest happiness formula in the world. And meanwhile, most of us are upset because the Wi-Fi is moody. Very noble suffering. His valet story is so good too because it exposes the whole status game. Nobody looks at the driver of the Rolls and thinks, wow, what a legend. They think I would like to be seen like that. That's the brutal reveal. People are mostly imagining themselves. Which means you are exhausting yourself for an audience that is not even watching you properly. Everybody is too busy starring in their own weird little movie. Exactly. Nobody is an extra in your life the way you think they are. And once you see that, showing off starts feeling kind of embarrassing. But I do think there is a split there depending on life stage. When you are younger, peacocking is almost part of the mating game. Which is a horrible phrase, but yes. Evolution is not classy. But once you have a partner, kids, a life, the flex becomes dead weight. Then it is not attraction, it is insecurity on repeat. And that is where his marriage theory lands too. If both people try to serve each other and expect nothing, the whole thing relaxes. That is such a healthier version of partnership than scoreboard marriage. Nobody wants to be audited by their spouse. But it connects to money perfectly because neediness is just high expectations in another outfit. And maybe that is why validation and spending get tangled together. People buy things to feel seen when they do not feel seen internally. That's why poverty and gambling fit into the book so well. Because if your life feels stuck, a lottery ticket starts looking like hope. And hope is powerful when your actual options feel tiny. I mean, if the day is brutal, even a dumb bet feels like a doorway. That is the part people miss when they judge from the outside. Because the behavior is irrational, but the feeling underneath is not. And he is always trying to separate the feeling from the decision. Like, yes, save money, but also understand why people do the opposite. That is why his advice does not feel preachy. Even his line to the broke person is not buy better stuff, it is buy control. Save enough so future you is less trapped. That is such a better slogan than financial freedom, honestly. Financial freedom sounds like a scam on a billboard. Yes, control sounds like something you can actually feel tomorrow. And then he gets to the weirdest claim, which is that money mind might be partly innate. I do not fully buy that it is fixed like that. Because you can be broke and learn discipline, or rich and be reckless. But maybe he means some people just intuit compounding and restraint faster. Or they get traumatized into it, which is also a school. His own ski accident story backs that up in a horrible way. 2 friends die and suddenly risk is not abstract anymore. That kind of loss rewires you instantly. Because when control is taken away in one moment, you stop romanticizing chaos. You start respecting downside in a way that never leaves you. And maybe that is the real thread through everything he says. Whether it is money, work, marriage, or health, the hidden luxury is control. Not more stuff, more room to breathe. More room to breathe is the whole game. And most people only realize it after they have already bought the wrong trophies. Which is depressing, but also kind of hopeful, because you can still change course. That is the best part of the conversation for me. He is basically saying you do not need to be a genius, you need endurance and restraint. And that is accessible, which is why people love his work. Also because he says the quiet part out loud and does not make it ugly. Save lower expectations. Stop performing for strangers. Buy time. That is basically the thesis, right? And somehow it sounds simple and impossible at the same time. Exactly, which is why it sticks. All right. Let us pause there before we get too spiritually rich about budgeting. Because I can already feel myself becoming unbearable. Next time we should get into the compounding side and the weird psychology of patience. Because that is where this thing gets really dangerous. Episode 2. Compounding, Waiting, and Why Slow Money Wins. Okay, and the wild part is he makes it sound almost offensively simple. Like save money, want less, buy freedom, done. Which is a brutal answer if you wanted a hack. But that is exactly why it lands. Because he is not selling fantasy, he is selling control. And honestly, that hits harder than spending ever does. Also, his whole thing about writing for himself is kind of hilarious. Most people say they are writing for the audience and then immediately start performing. Yeah, they are basically doing customer service with better fonts. He is like, no, I'm just sorting my own brain out. And weirdly, that makes the work more universal. Because when someone is actually honest, you recognize yourself in it. The rich versus wealthy distinction is the real grenade here, though. Because everybody says they want to be rich, but they mean they want to spend. They want the car, not the spreadsheet. Exactly. Rich is visible. Wealth is invisible. And invisible things are harder to flex on Instagram, so of course people ignore them. You cannot post unspent money feeling peaceful. 0 likes, terrible engagement. But independence is such a cleaner definition. Like you can stop working, change jobs, move cities, breathe. That is what people are buying when they think they are buying assets. And yet people still chase the mansion first. Because the mansion photographs better than autonomy. His father's story makes that whole argument way more emotional. An ER doctor, 20 years, night shifts, death in his hands, and then he could just leave. That is the difference between being tired and being trapped. That line matters so much. Because a lot of people think money buys luxury, but it really buys an exit. And exits are underrated until you desperately need one. Nobody claps for exits, though. True, they only clap for the entrance. But then he connects it to health, and that got me. Because chronic lack of control does not just annoy you, it wrecks you. People really act like stress is just a mood. It becomes blood pressure, heart disease, sleep, everything. Your body keeps score when your calendar owns you. And then he drops that thing about CEOs making insane money but having zero time. Like, congratulations, you are rich and hostage. Exactly, your calendar is now the boss. And I think that is why that part felt personal. Because successful people often do not feel freer, they just get more scheduled. Success can become a prettier cage. A golden cage with better coffee. And a terrifying Google Calendar. The part where he says he cancels things just to prove he still has control is funny. That is such a human confession. Because honestly, a lot of us do that in tiny ways. We say no to reclaim a little bit of ourselves. Even if the thing was useful, we are like, not today, freedom. The goalpost thing is nastier than people admit. Every time you hit the number, your brain instantly edits the number. That is such a scam built into ambition. And the scary part is he is right that the world keeps adapting. People got twice the income since the 1950s and still feel behind. Because your neighbor doubled too, so your brain refuses to celebrate. Baseline inflation is the real silent killer. That sounds like a finance villain. But the low expectations point is where it gets almost philosophical. Stephen Hawking saying his expectations dropped to zero is haunting. Because once expectation disappears, gratitude becomes automatic. Sunrise turns into a bonus instead of a given. And that is uncomfortable because it means happiness is partly a bookkeeping problem. The least sexy answer possible, by the way, but also maybe the most useful one. Because expectations are one of the few levers you actually control. Whereas income, status, market returns, all of that is noisy. Your own mind is the one thing not asking for a meeting invite. That was annoyingly good. The valet story was perfect because it strips away the myth. Nobody looks at the driver and thinks, wow, that person is enviable. They think, wow, I would look good in that car. Exactly, it is always self-insertion. Which means most showing off is actually just imagination marketing. And once you see that, the whole game feels smaller. Less glamorous, more pathetic. Which is a great detox. I also like that he does not pretend image never matters. For young people dating, building a life, signaling does matter a bit. But if you are still doing it at 40, something broke. That is such a savage sentence. And his Buffett line about success being loved by the people you want to love, you is strong. Because it shrinks the room down to what actually matters. 5 people, maybe, not the entire internet. The internet is a terrible family member. That is very true. Brent's marriage theory was surprisingly beautiful too. Serve your partner, expect nothing, and both people end up shocked. Unmet expectations are basically relationship poison. It is the same money principle in a different costume. The needy person always loses, whether it is love or money. Neediness is expensive in every currency. Holy hell, yes. And then the gambling piece gets dark fast. Low-income areas have more betting shops because hope is scarce. If you feel locked out, a lottery ticket starts looking like a door. That is why dismissing people as stupid misses the point. Sometimes they are not buying odds, they are buying a feeling. A tiny, temporary feeling that life could still turn. And that is such a human thing to chase. Same with cigarettes, alcohol, all of it. If your day is brutal enough, short-term relief looks rational. That part was hard to listen to, honestly. Because it takes the moral judgment out and replaces it with context. And then he returns to the most practical answer in the world. Save money. Unbelievably unsexy, unbelievably correct. That should be the subtitle of the whole book. I think the genius is that savings are framed as future control, not deprivation. Every dollar saved is a slice of your future that you own. That is a beautiful way to think about it. Because then saving is not punishment, it is sovereignty. And for somebody making $1,000 or $2,000 a month, that changes the frame completely. You stop asking how to look richer and start asking how to become harder to trap. That is the shift. And if you can lower expectations while building savings, maybe that is the whole game. Easy, right? Just rewire your personality and stop wanting shiny things. Simple, obviously. But I do think that is the tension he keeps pointing at. Money matters, but mostly because it buys calm, time, and choices. And once you see that, the whole definition of success changes. All right, let us leave it there before we turn into philosophers with overdrafts. Episode 2 is where we get into compounding, patience, and the sneaky power of staying boring. The wild part is he is not selling money. He is selling relief. Like people think they want a bigger house, but they want less panic. And that is such a brutal realization if you have ever chased status. Because status feels like success until your calendar owns you. That calendar line hit me too hard, honestly. He basically says wealth is unspent money, which is such a nasty definition. Nasty because it ruins the fantasy of spending your way into freedom. Exactly, because rich is visible and wealthy is quiet. Wealthy is the guy in the old shirt who can disappear whenever he wants. And that is where his whole point gets interesting. He is saying every dollar saved is basically future control, which is a much less sexy sales pitch than a Lamborghini. Wildly less sexy, but probably more useful. I love that he separates spending power from actual freedom. Because most people confuse the two for years. Have you noticed that too, that people say they want $1 million but mean spending it? Yes, they want the cosplay version of wealth. They want the receipt, not the asset. And that is why his independence point lands so hard. Being able to quit, breathe, or say no is the real luxury. And he makes it sound almost boring, which I respect. Because boring advice is usually the advice that works. Annoying, but true. His dad's story makes that even better. The ER doctor who could just retire because he lived below his means. That is such a different flex than buying a huge car. Imagine the win is not the car, it is the exit door. That is the real adult flex, honestly. Not being trapped by the life you built. And the funny thing is, people resent frugal parents until they understand them. Teenagers are famously not impressed by delayed gratification, especially when they know the doctor's salary is there. But then you see burnout and the whole thing flips. Control starts looking more valuable than consumption. That autonomy argument is huge because he ties it to stress and health. If your job owns your schedule, your body feels it. And people pretend stress is just in your head, which is ridiculous. Your heart is literally keeping score. That line should be in every office. He is basically saying freedom is a health intervention, which is insane when you think about it. Money as blood pressure management, not just lifestyle. Finance bros hate that framing because it is too honest. And then the expectations part gets even darker, because he is not saying ambition is bad. He is saying ambition without expectation. Management is a trap. That is the uncomfortable part, because everybody thinks more will fix it. More rarely fixes the wanting more problem. Exactly. It usually just upgrades the wish list. The Stephen Hawking example is brutal in the best way. Reduced expectations can make a sunrise feel like a gift. And that sounds poetic until you realize it is a survival skill. Like, low expectations are not pessimism. They are emotional leverage. And then he flips it into that idea that nobody is watching you as closely as you think. That one should save people a fortune in nonsense purchases. Half of luxury is just public insecurity. And the public is usually busy staring at itself anyway. Once you see that, showing off starts to feel expensive and embarrassing. But I do think there is a social function to signaling when people are young. Sure, mating season has its own terrible economics. Absolutely horrible phrase, but correct. The problem is when that performance never shuts off. Then your whole life becomes branding. And his marriage point is interesting because it is the same logic. If both people are serving, nobody is keeping score. The minute you keep score, the romance starts filing taxes. That is disgusting and accurate. Needy people want money, love, and praise to fill the same hole. And money cannot touch that hole for long. Which is why validation is such a dangerous addiction. Because once you need outside approval, you will spend forever feeding it. The lottery story made that feel very real. Poor people buy hope when nothing else looks reachable. And people who are comfortable pretend they would never do that. But if life feels sealed shut, tiny chances start looking rational. That is the part wealthy people miss when they judge. Hope is not always math. Sometimes it is oxygen. The same goes for gambling, honestly, especially when you are one bad week away from panic. He keeps coming back to the idea that if you have control, you can think clearly. And if you do not, every decision gets worse. That ski trip story is where it gets heavy. Because that was not abstract money wisdom, that was real loss. Two friends dying in the mountains changes your relationship with risk forever. Especially when the lesson is that control can vanish instantly. I think that is why he is so drawn to independence. Once you have seen life take control away, you want to buy it back. That is a much darker origin story than most money books have. But it makes the philosophy feel earned. And maybe that is why he keeps it so simple. Save money, own your future, stop auditioning for strangers. Honestly, that could be the whole book jacket. It is funny how obvious it sounds and how few people live it. Because the obvious stuff is usually the hardest to swallow. All right, we should probably leave the audience with that uncomfortable little knot in the stomach. Next episode, we get into compounding, patience, and why boring can be lethal. Because apparently the path to freedom is a lot less glamorous than people hope. And that is the annoying part, because freedom never looks sexy on Instagram. Nobody posts a picture of their emergency fund and gets applause. But that idea, rich versus wealthy, is such a mind-bender. Rich is visible, wealthy is invisible, and invisible wins. That should be written on every expensive car dashboard. Because most people say they want $1 million, but they mean to spend it. They want the $1 million life, not the $1 million balance sheet. And that is the whole trap, right there. Do you think people actually know that about themselves? Sometimes, but they lie to themselves with nicer words. No one says, I want to look rich and panic quietly. But a lot of behavior says exactly that. The weird part is how much relief comes from not buying things. That sounds boring until you realize boring is freedom. The market sells excitement, but the soul wants breathing room. That sounds like something a monk would tweet after a hedge fund internship. Exactly, but he would be right and everyone would hate it. What hit me was his thing about writing for an audience of one. That is such a good antidote to pandering. If you write for everybody, you end up sounding like a brochure. And nobody has ever changed their life because of a brochure. But writing for yourself also takes some nerve. Because you are basically saying, this is what I needed to hear. And if it helps someone else, great, but that is not the first filter. I respect that, but it also feels dangerously honest. Dangerous honesty is usually where the good stuff lives. The autonomy piece is what really lands, though. Because a lot of people think money buys luxury, but it buys control. And control is almost emotional, not financial. Exactly, it is waking up and not being yanked around by life. Which is rare because most calendars are just hostage situations. That is the most accurate thing about modern success. When he talks about his dad retiring because he could, that hits hard. That is the dream, not the car or the watch. Being able to stop when your body says stop. And his dad had that because he saved like a maniac for years. Which is funny because frugality gets mocked until it saves your life. Then suddenly it is called wisdom. The ER doctor detail makes it even stronger. If your job is that brutal, spending everything is almost a trap. Because then you are not tired, you are trapped. That is why control over your time matters so much. It is not some luxury add-on, it is a health variable. The stress stuff was wild, honestly. Your body does not care that you are making it. It only cares that your heart is acting like it is under attack. And the celebrity CEO example is brutal too. Imagine making $50 million and still being scheduled like a robot. That is rich on paper and poor in time. Poor in time is such a savage phrase. But it is real because time is the actual currency. I liked his point that sometimes you cancel something just to feel in control. That is very human, a little petty, but very human. Because if everything in your day is assigned, you start rebelling. Even if the rebellion is just not taking a meeting. The low expectations thing is where it gets almost philosophical. He is basically saying happiness is a gap, not a number. Which is offensive to every ambition addiction in the room. Yeah, because people want a formula that sounds more heroic. But his point is smarter than that. If your expectations outrun your income, you are cooked. Doesn't matter if your income is huge, you still feel broke. And that is the weird psychological curse of money. Every win resets the floor under your feet. The Stephen Hawking story was probably the cleanest example of that. When your expectations hit zero, a sunrise becomes a jackpot. That is such a brutal and beautiful lesson at the same time, and it makes the rest of us look a little spoiled, especially because we are annoyed by tiny inconveniences like toddlers. But I do think there is a practical side to low expectations. It is not about being passive, it is about not mentally inflating everything, which is easier said than done when everyone around you is flexing. That valeting story was so sharp, though. Nobody looks at the driver and thinks, wow, he is the hero. They just want to imagine themselves in the seat. And once you see that, the whole performance loses power. That is why status symbols are such a scam. They are expensive ways of begging strangers for attention. That is a nasty sentence, but it is basically true. The best financial skill might just be not needing applause, because applause is unstable and never enough. I also liked his point about relationships and needing less validation. The marriage theory was simple but kind of devastating. Serve the other person and don't invoice them emotionally. That is actually hilarious and incredibly true. Needy people are just expectations in human form. That line should terrify a lot of relationships. Because once every act becomes a test, love gets exhausted. That is the pattern everywhere, not just money. The gambling and lottery part got uncomfortably real too. Because on the surface it looks irrational, but underneath it is hope. And hope gets expensive when life feels sealed shut. If your only shot feels like a lottery ticket, of course you buy one. I hate how understandable that is. Same with the cigarettes, the alcohol, the little hits of relief. It is easy to judge from the outside and totally miss the context. That is why his work lands, because he keeps returning to incentives. He keeps taking the moral lecture and turning it into psychology, which is way harder and way more useful. And that final advice to the younger version of himself was basically, save and buy freedom. Not a bigger house, not a nicer car, just options. Options are the real luxury good. That line is going on a t-shirt somewhere. But it is the truth, and it is annoyingly simple. All right, we should probably stop before we accidentally become responsible adults, which would be a terrible brand decision for us. Next episode, we get into compounding, patience, and why boring can be lethal. Because the real magic starts when you stop trying to get rich quickly. And that is where the whole thing gets even more interesting.